Welcome back to the studio. Today what I'm going to be focusing on is the first in 3 videos that I'm going to use incorporating this old quilt that I made a long time ago. I always hear people say that they're afraid that their past is going to catch up with them. In my case, I'm still trying to catch up with my past. I used to teach quilting at a local quilt shop, and one of the things we were constantly doing is trying to pump out samples to get people enrolled in the class. And what happens when you're on that roller coaster is that you're always behind, and sometimes you make tops that never get made into quilts. And this is an example of that. It's a pretty basic quilt, and that was what some of the things that I taught were simpler things that people could get finished. This one is sort of a medallion quilt. It has a star in the middle and then just concentric layers of borders. There's 4 patches with regular solid blocks, and then alternating with just solid light green and dark green. I don't remember the name of this pattern, so don't bother asking. I don't know that I'd even be able to find the pattern. I have since moved. The first part of this is going to be loading a quilt. I'm going to go over some of the basics of loading. This is more going to be for beginners. People who've been quilting for a long time may learn a tip or two, but you probably are already set on your own way of loading a quilt. Some of the things that I have on my table here, these are leader clamps. I got these from Jamie Wallen at Quilters Apothecary. Urban Elements does not sell these, but you could go to Quilters Apothecary website and order these. I believe they come in a pack of 6 or 8. They're PVC, polyvinyl chloride, and they're just white. As you'll see, I have the hibiscus tattoo on it. These tattoos come in 2 different colors, pink and green. Now those came from Urban Elements, and if you're placing an order, you could add one of these tattoo samples for free, or you could just message them and say that you would like a tattoo sample for free. They come in either printed on white or printed on clear. The printed on white are always the best bet if you're not sure which one to use. Printed on white you would have to use on anything that was not white, so anything like a gray laptop, a gray Longarm machine, a black Longarm machine, you would want printed on white. Otherwise the whole decal disappears. Printed on clear is good for white. So if you have a doubt, get printed on white. So those are my leader clamps, and I'll show you how I use those. The other thing that I've been using ever since I started long arming are Corsage Pens. These are about 2.5 to 3 inches long. They have a big pearlish looking head, and they're very thick, and they have a nice sharp point. I use these to load my quilt on the frame. There are other things that you could use or invest in later. Some people like the red clamps, and some people like zippers. I would investigate those before you invest, because some people like them and some people don't, even after purchasing them. The pens are just a couple bucks for a box of 250, and it's just what I got stuck pen. It's just what I am happy using. I'm very confident with it. I know how to use it, and I just didn't feel like I needed to do anything else. So I have my pens there. Another thing that, and this may be a little controversial, but I'm all about a good controversy. Sometimes I use 505 temporary spray adhesive as an extra set of hands when I'm getting to my layers. After I have my backing pinned to the quilt and I want to go ahead and put the batting down, and I want to get the batting basted, sometimes it doesn't stay on the line exactly where I want it, so I'll just put a touch of 505 temporary spray adhesive between the 2 layers. Then I can go ahead and baste it in place, and it holds long enough for me to baste it. Temporary spray adhesive only lasts for a few hours depending on your climate. It's not permanent. It completely evaporates away, and it doesn't leave residue. Having said that, you don't want to spray a gob on there. It's just a mist will do. Sometimes I'll also spray it on top of the batting when I'm putting my quilt top down until I can get it basted. It just helps hold it into a straight line. But I'll show you that as I go. This particular quilt is about 60 inches, and so I'm going to need backing that's at least 72 inches. And this is a square quilt, so 60 inches square. The backing and batting both will be 72 inches at least. And people always want to know why we waste so much fabric. Well, the quilt itself only gets attached at the very bottom to the bottom leader. That's if you're not floating. Those who float, the quilt is never attached to the frame. It's only attached to the batting and backing, which is attached to the frame. So the batting and the backing have to exceed the size of the quilt, and it has to clamp on to the top leader, the bottom leader, and the side. Where that quilt attaches to the leaders or the frame is an area that you do not want the head of your machine to sew. You're either using zippers, the red snappers, or pens, all of which would damage the head of your machine and your timing if you were to sew over top of it. So you want to create a barrier between the edge of the quilt and where the backing is attached to the frame. That is on all four sides. The other thing that you need to know is how far away is the center needle from the edge of my table, my ruler base. On my machine, and I'll show you, it's about 6 inches from where the needle position is to where the edge of that table is. And if you're using any kind of clamp system, the edge of the table will hit your clamping system that is attached to your backing, and you won't be able to sew all the way to the edge of the quilt. That's going to cause some really ugly marks on the quilt, and that doesn't matter if you're doing ruler work, free motion work, pantos from the back, or a digital design. If you have that ruler table on there, that's going to increase that size. So I always just add 6 inches to each side. That's a total of 12 inches, and for the top and bottom as well. So I'm going to move the camera and show you what I'm talking about with that ruler table. And even if that ruler table isn't in place, you still have several inches, but I always factor in my ruler table, because if you ever need to stitch in the ditch or base the edge of the quilt, you may need to pop your ruler base on. So I don't let customers dictate to me what I need for my backing. I dictate that. If they don't have sufficient quantity, I'm not going to risk my machine, the timing on my machine, to do them a favor. It's not my job, essentially, to make quilting affordable for somebody else. This is a hobby, it's an interest, and I would rather do it the right way than the wrong way and cause damage to my equipment. So let me show you the ruler base and the measuring of that, and then we'll get started on loading the quilt backing to the frame. I will also say we have a big controversy always with anything, but one of the things people talk about is washing or not washing their fabric or their backing. Backing fabric has sizing in it the way all fabric does. But because backing fabric isn't a top seller, manufacturers intend for it to be on the shelf a little bit longer, and so they use a very heavy duty sizing on there so it keeps its shape and looks good on the roll. That chemical can be very hard to puncture through with a needle. It will dull the needle very quickly. So an unwashed back will dull the needle and could even cause some punching through of the needle rather than piercing through. So that's one thing. The other thing for me personally, well, I want to know if it's going to bleed. I want it to bleed before I use it. But thirdly, you're going to get shrinkage when you wash cotton fabric. And I have bought 108-inch goods and lost 8 inches due to shrinkage. And some of you might say, well, I don't want it to then be shorter than what I need. Well, I don't want to make a quilt and then have the back shrink up 8 inches and the front not shrink, because it's going to pull the front with it. They're attached. So if you're going to have that much shrinkage, I want it to be done before I ever get it on the quilt. If I have to sew a strip on, I would rather do that than have the whole front of my quilt distorted, especially if you're working on something like a hand applique Baltimore album quilt or any kind of applique work where you've spent so much time working on it, and then to have it all shriveled up because you didn't wash the backing. So that's my just my opinion, of course. We'll have comments from a million people saying why they don't think so, and that's fine. One of the other things that I've learned is what other people think about me is really none of my business. So that helps me stay happy. I do have up here 2 other things. These are just leftover fabric. This is a green tackle twill fabric, and I've sewed them up into different sizes and different weights. Inside these are pinto beans, in my case, and I just fold an envelope, put the beans in, and then top stitch the edge there. These are really good when you have fabric that's a little too ample in a specific area. You can put these weights on either side of the sewing bar where the needle head is sewing, and it pulls down a little bit and causes more tautness where you have a little bit of excess fabric. I've also used these in times when I'm getting a lot of vibration on the quilt and I'm trying to film something, and so I could just place these on the quilt in an area that's already been sewn, and it helps to cut back on some of the vibration. But these are handy to have, and I have them in several sizes and weights, and it's just a little useful tip. You can see my needle position here and the edge of my ruler base. Doesn't look like it would be that big, but when you lay your ruler down, this is a 6-inch wide ruler. It actually exceeds the size of my 6-inch ruler, so that's about 6 1/4. That would make the total that I would need at least 12 1/2. But you also have to accommodate the size of whatever kind of clamping you're using. So if your clamps take up another inch, you could almost need 13 or 14 inches on each side. It always sounds like a lot when you're explaining it to somebody, but when you get down to bare tacks, that's what the number is. So I'm going to go ahead and move this out of the way, and we'll get our fabric. Since this is geared for beginning quilters, people just learning how to use their long arm, I'm going to get on my soapbox a minute about something else. It'll be easy for me to do today because I'm hot and sweaty and grumpy. But I just want to say that these long arm machines are very expensive. The manufactured suggested retail on Bernina Bernina Q24 is around $24,000. I have the IntelliQuilter attached to mine. That's an additional $12,000. So I have invested somewhere around $36,000 in my equipment, and that's without any designs. So when people come to me and ask me to do their charity quilts for free, or to because they're my friend, to quilt for them for free, I just say no. I don't have any guilt about that. I did not finance my machine so that I could run a charitable organization. Now, for those of you who want to do charity quilts and you can afford to do that, I say amen to you and God bless you. But I did not go to all the trouble to pay for my machine to just do charity work and free quilting. Once you start doing free quilting, it seems like it never ends. I know there are a ton of really amazing charitable organizations. People want to donate quilts to Quilts of Valor, to disaster victims, to cancer patients, to the pediatric cancer center, to children's hospitals. The list goes on and on and on. And I don't mind doing that when I want to, but I can't be guilted into spending all of my time in just making charitable organization donations. There's something called an opportunity cost, and that means that you could either be working on your quilt or you could be cooking your kids' dinner. Generally, you can't be doing both at the same time. You could be out hiking or you could be at home studying for an exam. You generally can't do both at the same time. So there is an opportunity cost. It's a decision that we make how we spend our time. And I choose to spend my time backing my investment, and that is learning my craft. And the reason that I got a Longarm was so that I could fulfill my design aspirations for quilting. So that's just my soapbox for giving you permission to say no when you're overwhelmed, when you've got too much to do, and when you've got too much invested in your equipment to give it away for free. I'm giving you that permission to say no. I have the fabric here for my backing, and I'm going to give you a couple little tips for that. I had 108-inch goods here. I don't mind cutting down my large backs when I have a project and I don't want a pieced back. I don't generally wash my back until I'm ready to use it, and the reason for that is because it is hard to fold and keep folded neatly until you need it. So I just wash it usually the day before. If it gets wrinkled in the dryer, a nice tip is to wet a towel, a little hand towel, and squeeze the water out, but put it in the dryer with the dry wrinkled product. Put it back in the dryer for 5 or 6 minutes, and the moisture from the towel will steam the item that's in the dryer and pull the wrinkles out. That's tip number 1. Tip number 2, I needed approximately 74 inches square of my backing, so I measured 74 inches and ripped off the excess, giving me straight cuts, and then I ironed the 74 inches. Ironing 74 inches is a lot easier than ironing 102 inches. So that's another thing that I do. There's also a product called Downy Wrinkle Release. It's a spray. They also have a fabric softener or dryer sheets. But when I have wrinkles that are stubborn to get out, I'll go ahead and spray the wrinkle release and then iron it. Or once this is on the frame, loaded, then I can spritz it and roll it up and just let it ease the wrinkles out while it's resting. So those are some of my backing tips. The way that this machine is set up, this is the way that the leader rolls through the equipment. I have the bar here, it rolls back, and it rolls under this dead bar. The dead bar doesn't move generally. It's adjusted to fit the height of the sewing machine, but the leader does have to go back behind it and under it. This is what holds the quilt flat so that it feeds through the sewing machine nicely. So I have to make sure this is fed through right before I start pinning. I like to pin from back here, and I want to be able to do it standing up. So I have my leader pulled right around the way that it's supposed to be, but now I can pull my top over top and start pinning it while I'm standing up. Can't reach it. I'm going to go ahead and get it and get my pins, which I didn't get, but I'm going to come back here to center position. Okay, I have my backing laid over top of the leader that I'm going to pin it to. You'll notice that the pretty side of the fabric is facing down. This side here is what is going to be the side that touches the batting. And when I had this upstairs and I was ironing it, I made a center mark, and I made a mark 2.5 inches. It's just a faint line. I used a permanent marker because this is ultimately going to get cut off. But I made a line for me to visually use when I'm attaching the batting to make sure it stays in a straight line. So I'm going to attach the center line of my piece. If this was let's say it was 60 inches, my center mark would be 30. Whatever the size is, it's half of that. And on my leader, I've got lots of markings on my leader also, every 5 inches, I believe, or maybe every 6 inches. I have these dotted lines, but I connected this center dotted line with a red mark, so when I'm loading a backing, I can get a quick reference to the center point. And I always like to load my quilts center. It just makes it easier to keep track of both the bottom and top to make sure they're aligned. Now, like I said, I'm just going to be using Corsage pens. I'm going to be starting at the center mark, and I'm going to be moving in an outward direction. As you can see, I have the selvage edge attached to the leader. A selvage is very stiff and it doesn't allow for any stretch whatsoever, and it just makes for a good connection to the leader itself. If you run the selvage down the sides, you're still going to get a little bit of stretch in the center, but the selvage will never stretch, so sometimes you can get a little bit of pooling of the fabric. So I always like to have my selvage running horizontally. I'm attaching pins in the very top 1/4 inch of both the selvage and the leader, and there's about 1 inch in between. That selvage is so strong, I'm going to get a good connection to the leader that way. Now you'll notice that I'm heading towards the my left, so I'm pinning towards the left, and it's kind of a good habit to get into, to pin in that direction. If I pin from the center to the right over here and the left over here, when I go to smooth out the quilt, I won't poke my hands with the pins because my pins are running the same way I'm smoothing, and that way I won't get blood on my quilt. It does take a little bit of practice. You have to learn to be ambidextrous. And I always like to get one jab of the pen in the very, very edge of the quilt, just so it can't pull in. Now I'm going to do from the center to the right. And my pens now are going to be headed in that direction. And you'll find that one direction is certainly easier than the other, but it gets better. Okay, I finished pinning. You can see the pins in place, and this is how the leaders would roll up with that pinned in place. Now what I want to do is roll this up until we get to the point that the leader is just barely sticking out the bottom of my dead bar. But now I can show you how I use these leader clamps. These just clamp over top of the leader, and I know probably some people just use them after they've got the leader rolled up to hold them in place, but I kind of like to use them as clamps to help me roll. If I use these to roll up the leader as I go, I'm keeping that leader as tight as I can get it. It's not going to block anything because this is all going to be excess. This is helping that leader stay as tight to the roll as possible. It is literally forcing the wrinkles out of the leader, which is what I want. So we're right about there is where I want. And this leader is as tight as I'm going to be able to get it. Now as the quilt advances, I don't have to worry about those. They'll just stay out of my way. When I get that about where I want it, I can go ahead and lock up my top bar, and now I can move to the bottom of the quilt, and I can pin the bottom backing to the back leader at the front. And it's basically going to be the same thing I did for the back. If you can see, this is my backing leader. It says back right on it in the case of Bernina. And I'm going to go ahead and pin the bottom of my back. Again, I'm paying attention that this is face down. I don't want to have the whole thing quilted with the fabric inside out. And you'll see I also have this red line delineating the center of my leader. It's lined up to the center of this leader, so that when I put the center mark of my bottom with the center mark of that, I can go ahead and pin these in place, and I know that the back is perfectly aligned with the two leaders. So this center mark on the bottom of the backing is the third marking that I make on my backing. I make a center line on the top, a center line on the bottom, and then I make a 2.5 inch mark all the way across the top, and that's where I line up my batting and my top. So again, I'm going to line up my center mark, and I'm going to pin about 1/4 inch from both the top edge of the leader and the edge of that quilt. And I'm going to pin from the center out in this way and the center out that way. So if I'm smoothing the quilt as I roll, I won't get any pin pokes on my finger, and I won't get any blood on the quilt. I'm just making sure that I keep the edge of the two items together. The backing fabric and the leader, I want those to be right up to the edge with each other. Now I'm going to pin from the center out in this direction. And I have my pin tray here, my little pin holder. One thing that you do want to pay attention to, it's just something you learn, is to keep eye on the canopy that I've created with the backing fabric, that I haven't lost any pins down in there, because you don't want to quilt a pin into your quilt. And I have actually done that once. And, well, it was one of my quilts. It was an art quilt. Well, it is an art quilt. It's actually an art quilt that's on display this week. And the pin's still in there. One day, I'll have to get brave and take the pin out. Fortunately, it's in a spot, it's in the between the batting and the top, oddly, instead of the batting in the back. But it's in a spot where I could put a hole to open up in the applique and then close the hole back up. But I'm still nervous about doing it. I have my quilt pen center out from both the top and bottom. The top is finished and rolled up with my leader clamps, and it's locked into position. The backing bar is not locked yet, so I'm going to go ahead and add on my beautiful, helpful leader clamps that I got from Quilters Apothecary. And you can see I like a lot of them. And we have our Urban Element tattoo on them. I'm going to start rolling up. I'm just going to keep going until I have the leader itself completely rolled up and it's nice and tight. And then I can just start rolling up the quilt. And my leader is gripped. I know it's not going to slip. So I'm just going to lightly smooth, making sure that my edges line up as I roll. And if I smooth this out, I'm not getting poked with my pins. Now I can go ahead and lock this into place, and we have a pretty good fit. I have my center marking here, so I know where to lay the center of my quilt top. I also have that marking 2.5 inches down from the selvage. That 2.5 inches protects my machine. When I go to base the very top of the quilt, I'm 2.5 inches away from pins. Same at the bottom. When I get to the bottom, I have several inches before I get to any pins. When I clamp onto the side with my side clamps, those are going to be 6.5 inches away from the needle position and far enough away from the table that I'm not knocking the clamps, which is stitching out a bad design on the quilt. So the next part I'm going to do is load batting, and I load batting the same size as my backing, and I will tell you why. As we roll the quilt up, if the batting is only in the center 60 inches, but none of it is on the last 6 or 8 inches to the outside, as we roll this quilt up, the center part will get fatter. There's nothing holding this space with fullness. So the edges will continue to sag on the backing, but it won't be sagging in the middle. And this causes some people a lot of problems keeping the tension on the quilt straight. So if the batting goes all the way to the edge of the backing, this quilt sandwich will be even all the way to the edges as I roll it up. Now there is a little bit of a fix to that if somebody's giving you a quilt with not enough backing. And you could save your strips of batting, single layers, double layers, triple layers that you've stitched on top of, and feed those in to the edges as you're rolling it up to keep the quilt even. Some people don't think this is a big deal, but for me it's a no-brainer. I never load a quilt that the batting isn't flush all the way out to the edge of the backing. It just keeps the tension beautiful all the way through the process. I'm not going to talk a lot about brands of batting, but I am going to talk about batting a little bit since I am going to be doing it. I'm actually want the quilting on this particular quilt to be very dimensional. So for that reason, I'm going to be using two battings. One of them is going to be either an 80-20, which is 80% cotton, 20% polyester, or 100% cotton. It depends on what I have on the roll upstairs. So I'm going to cut a piece of that. A lot of the needle punched cotton have dimples and pimples, and you will hear different people say different things about how they load it. I will only tell you how I load it. When the batting is fat and they are punching it at the needle punching it at the factory, they have dozens of needles that puncture through the layers of batting, kind of intertwining it. It's a little bit of like needle punching wool, and as that goes through, that's what binds the layers of the batting together. I like to load my batting the same way that they needle punched it. So where the needles go through the top, it creates a dimple. That's the top. And where it comes to the bottom, that makes a little bump that's like a little cotton pimple. So when I load pimples down, dimples up. That only applies to like needle punched batting. If you're working with a wool batting or a synthetic batting, it may not have that at all. So sometimes batting does have a right and wrong side, and sometimes it doesn't. But when I use cotton poly blend, it always goes on the bottom. I'm also going to do a second layer today. The second layer is going to be 100% wool. It's only going to be like a 1/4 of an inch thick. That's naturally what it is, that size generally. And that creates loft. It's going to give a little bit of bounce, fullness to the top. And it makes the quilting dimensional. They also say that wool batting will help prevent creases from developing in a quilt as it's folded. So when you unfold a quilt that's been in storage that has wool batting, it doesn't have a lot of permanent creases in it. I'm using it mostly for loft because I already know what quilting design I want on here, and I really want that to punch visually when it's finished. So I'm going to cut two battings. They're both going to be the same size, the full size of my backing. And I know that's going to be a little bit of waste, but I always save the strips for other small projects. And I'm going to go upstairs and get both of those cut, and we'll get the first one basted on. It's almost impossible to get the camera close enough, but on this side, which is my top, I have little tiny dimples where the needles punched through it. On the back side are little tiny pimples, little tiny bumps. That's the side I want down. Now, I know some people are going to disagree with that. That's the way I do it. The reason it even matters is because if it's done other than the way it wants to be done, the batting can get punched through the back of the quilt, and you'll have what's called bearding. You'll see little bits of white fuzz all over the back of the quilt. That also could come from not washing the backing and the needles being forced to punch through because it can't get through the chemicals, and it also could be a dull needle. But for that reason, I always do it with the dimples up, pimples down. Also, you'll see my center mark here and my 2.5 inch line mark here. I'm lining up the center of my batting with that 2-inch mark. And if you need an extra set of hands to hold the batting in place while you're basting it, you could always spray a little band of the 505 temporary spray adhesive just to help you hold the batting in place while you baste. I'm going to start at my center mark and move out with the basting function. I'm going to pull the bobbin thread up. I'm on basting. And now I'm going to the center out, keeping the batting smooth without stretching everything. And now I have basted the very top of that batting to the fabric. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of these threads where I pulled up, because it's amazing the trouble excess little threads like that could cause. Now I'm going to go ahead and cut my wool batting and bring it down and baste it in the same way that I did the cotton. The wool batting is here now. Wool batting is really spongy and stretchy, and for that reason it makes it a little bit harder to get an exact cut on it. So you have to allow yourself a little bit of margin of either too much or not enough, because you'll cut it flat and then you'll lift it up and it will smush and stretch. The other thing about it is it's kind of like really soft Wonder Bread. When you're trying to smear butter on it, it will tear really easily. So you have to be very careful when you're handling 100% wool with your hands, because you could really stretch it out of shape and leave a bare spot. But why it's so wonderful is it's going to create a really beautiful dimension on your quilt. Now if you were just doing one batting, you would skip the second batting step, and when we get to the top you'll see how that goes. But as I said, I'm using this additional layer. A lot of people do it for art quilts because it really makes the quilting stand out. But I'm doing it basically for the same reason. I really want dimensionality in the finished product. But because it's so stretchy, I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm going to pull back the edge and do a thin spray of the basting spray just to hold that batting in place while I baste it with the machine. I really like to do it with the wool because the wool is so thick that the hopping foot will get caught in it. So I'm going to use my hand to try and smooth it, or you could also use one of those saucer kind of foot for the machine to help keep it down. But either way, I like the batting. It just is like a little bit of an extra set of hands to keep it in place while you're basting. You also really want to be careful of your batting on the ground at this point, because it would be really easy to step on, and if you step on it you're going to tear it as well. But I could really get that batting exactly where I want it without stretching it out of place. And you can see I actually did put on a different foot. I'm going to start at the center again. This saucer shaped foot or bowl shaped foot will help me keep the edge of the batting down. And I want to stay as close to the edge of the top as I can. If I sew a ½ an inch in and I use the digital system, the machine will sew off, catch that batting and make it overlap back on when the foot pulls back in this direction. So I want to baste as close to the edge as I can so it doesn't allow for any overlap of the batting while the machine is stitching. And you can see I'm keeping my hand right here in front to help keep the batting smoothed down while I'm stitching over it. In essence, I kind of double basted that edge. I always want to cut off any excess thread, because I tell you, those could get caught up in the machine while it's stitching and cause the machine to stop stitching, cause an obstruction notice. It's amazing what foul play a little bit of extra thread will cause. So now that I have the batting, both layers done, I'm going to go ahead and try and fold the batting up under the machine as neatly as possible to keep those two layers smooth, and then I'm going to get the top ready. Well, I have the backing, the battings, both layers, ready for loading my top. But before I load the top, I want to make sure if I need to do any marking on the top. If I need to find any center points, for instance, if I needed the center of the top, I would want to mark that now while it's off of the machine. If I wanted to do the center of the two sides, because I was doing a border element that I wanted to mirror image at the middle, I would need to mark that now. Once you get it on the rollers, you're not going to be able to get an accurate measurement. What I'm going to be doing for the quilt that I already know the pattern that I'm going to be using, I'm going to need to know the center, where the center mark of this quilt is. Now that's going to be fairly easy for me to know where that is, because I have a center star, and right where the center point of the flying geese unit is would be my very center line. If I didn't have that star there and a way to denote that center area, I would want to mark it with a water-soluble pen or a white chalk pencil, something that I could remove later. But I would want to mark anything that I need to while it's off the machine, and you're able to get accurate measurements. So all I have to do now is find the center of my quilt top, and I did not mark that, so I'm just going to very carefully fold my quilt in half and give myself a pin. And that center mark on both the top and bottom is going to also line up with the center mark on my leaders, just the way everything else has. And even though I have a little bit of leeway because the backing is so much bigger, I still want these to be positioned correctly so I don't get any torquing in the quilting design, and it doesn't have a wonky shape when I take it off of the frame. I have the center of my top lined up with the center marking on the backing, which is also lined up with the center mark on my leader. And as I said before, this wool batting is really scrunchy. So again, I'm going to utilize my temporary spray adhesive just to give an extra grip while I'm basting this in place. And I'm going to smooth this down as I go. And this time I'm going to be lining the edge of my quilt up with my previously stitched line, which was about 1/4 of an inch down. So I have about 1/4 of an inch of batting, both the cotton and the wool, sticking out above the top. That's all going to get trimmed off when the quilt comes off of the frame. But now I'm going to go ahead and bring the head of my machine back and baste from the center out and down the side of each edge. And I just want to say another thing. I have measured this quilt from the center out and the center out to get its size. But I've also measured all 4 sides of the quilt. And if you're just starting, this may be a really good tip, a good habit to get into, because I have seen quilts where the left side is 60 inches and the right side is 63 inches. There could be a huge variance on the sizing of the quilt. And if you have that issue, you'd want to know it before you quilted it, because it's not going to quilt out flat. Somewhere along the line added too much border fabric, or there was some other problem. But measure the top and bottom and make sure they're both the same size. measure the right and left and make sure that those are the same size. And you can save yourself a lot of trouble down the line. So I'm going back to my center mark. I'm going to pull the bobbin thread up. I'm holding both my bottom and my top and bottom thread at the same time. Take a couple stitches. I'm still on my basting function, and I'm going to base as close to the top edge as I can get. Again, I don't want to baste so far away from the edge that that edge can bend back over onto the quilt as the quilt is getting digitally quilted. And now I'm going to come down the side. Woo. I pulled up my bobbin thread so I can trim it. And I'm going to go back to my start of the center. At this point, the way that quilt is loaded as is, with the bottom portion of the top just draping, this is called floating a quilt. And you'll find a lot of people arguing whether this is a good way or a bad way. And probably it all comes down to their experience. So what that tells you is, some people have had good luck with this, and some people have not had such good luck with it. That probably also comes down to their experience. What my experience tells me personally is, if I'm doing a very small to a medium-sized quilt, I don't mind trying this. Usually it works. If I'm doing a queen-size quilt or a king-size quilt, I am not going to float it, ever. And in fact, I'm not going to float this quilt. I'm going to pin it, pin the bottom to the bottom leader, or the top leader. But on a king size or a queen size quilt, you've got so much roll up happening there that I want tension on all four sides the way that the frame was designed. That's why I go to all the trouble to make sure I've marked my center point on the backing, the batting, the top, matching it to all three leaders, my center point, so that I can eliminate any possibility of an issue later. But the frame was designed to have tension on all four sides, and that's the way I try and keep it. That's just my general rule. However you want to play in your sandbox is totally up to you. But I'm going to pin the bottom to the top leader and roll it up. And when I have that intention, that I'm going to put pins on the two side and use my side clamps. And then I'll be finished getting this quilt ready and loaded. After that, really there isn't anything else to do except figure out how you're going to quilt it. You're wide open at this point. You could do free motion quilting or practice. But if you're just going to practice, you're just starting, I really would not load a quilt that you've made. I would go to a big box retailer and buy some wide fabric, plain fabric on sale with a coupon, and just quilt with that. Practice on that, either with doing a panto or free motion work or ruler work, whatever you want to learn. And then when you're finished scribbling over and over and over on that fabric, you could cut it up and use it for drop cloths, put it in the trunk for loading furniture at garage sales. I cut it up for pet bedding, cut it into squares big enough to use for animals. Some animal shelters will take them for bedding for that purpose, but I practice on those for new thread techniques and new ideas, and then when I'm confident, then I'll load a quilt. So I'm going to roll up the bottom, get it on the frame, and I can go ahead and get this ready for the next phase. The next video I'm going to be doing with this quilt, I'm going to be using a water-soluble thread, and I'm going to be thread basting the entire quilt about every 4 to 6 inches, because the design I'm going to be using is intricate and needs to its placement to be as accurate as possible, and basting it will be very helpful in that process. So I'm going to go, next step is to finish the bottom off, and then we can get rolling at the end of this video. I have the quilt top basted there. I'm getting ready to pin the bottom part of the top. So I'm just kind of going to accordion pleat the top on top of the quilt that's already loaded. I have my center pin, and now I'm going to swing this leader up. This leader attaches to the top of the quilt. You'll see I also have my red marking here for the center. I have the red, or the center mark, on my pen. And I'm going to pin this the exact same way I pinned the other 2 leaders, center out, even though I won't really be smoothing that this much. And I've lost my glasses, so I don't even think I can see the pen. So I'm going to go ahead and finish pinning this in both directions, and then I'll turn it back on. But in the meantime, I have to find my glasses. I have the top pinned to the top leader, which is going to pivot down. So I have to leave a little bit of slack in that when it gets ready to pivot back down. So I'm not going to wind it completely tight. But I'm going to go ahead and use my clamps again. And on here it's probably not as critical to get those as tight, because of how far it hangs down. It gives us a little bit of leeway anyway, but I do want to get it to roll up fairly straight. A good rule of thumb is just to keep the edges overlapping. If it starts to shrink in, you know you've got a problem somewhere. Now you can see I only have a little bit left, so at this point I can go ahead and pivot back down and finish tightening it up from here. Now, some of the things you could do at this point is look through the quilt and pull off any loose threads. I can't tell you how many times I've had a problem with some little thread getting caught on the hopping foot and causing issues with the stitching. Make sure that the batting is even as it's going down. Check for any imperfections, and the last thing we're going to do is I'm going to put pins in the edge. I'm going to pin through both the batting and the backing. I put 2 side by side, and for me that just gives something for the teeth of my clamps to grip onto. Now, this is going to be another issue that I've heard people debating, and again, you could go on either side that you want. Some people will only clamp their backing fabric, they do not clamp the batting. They say if you clamp the batting that you could be stretching it and making a thin spot in it, and it could affect tension. I pin based through all of it because I don't want the backing to be taut and the batting to be loose and start shifting to the left or the right. I like to keep them all evenly tight without stretching a hole in the batting. So however you want to play in your sandbox is totally up to you. But I get fairly good results with my method. I'm sure other people get good results with theirs. Either way, what you're doing is keeping even tension on the back so you don't get wrinkles. And if you don't have wrinkles to begin with, that's one good step. But I like to keep a nice even tension, and so this is just about it. I'm not going to be sewing today, so I'm not actually going to keep my quilt tight. But tomorrow when I come back out, I'll go ahead and put my clamps on both of my sets of pins and increase the side tension to my desired amount. And in the meantime, I'm just going to loosen that up so I'm not stretching the quilt. But that's pretty much it for loading my quilt today. This whole video is intended to replace a video that I had made in the past when I first started doing the videos for Urban Elements. I've learned some things are not the way we grew up to understand them. When I started making the videos, I was very nervous about dead space, dead air. Like they used to say on old radio stations, you always had to either have music or talking. So in the beginning, I was afraid to make a video without some kind of noise going at all times, so I would play ambient music in the background very quietly. It helped take the tension off of me thinking I had to talk constantly. The problem was that that caused a lot of complaints, people saying they couldn't hear me, which I find hard to believe, but that's what they said. So I made this video a second time, but the second time I had the air conditioner going in here. And guess what? The air conditioner was so loud on the microphone that I couldn't use any of that video either. So this is the third time I've made the loading the quilt video. I know I've already said how I feel about letting people overtake your joy. I got into quilting because I absolutely love it. The reason that I kept buying equipment that it would allow me to do more was so I could fulfill my fantasy, my dream of what I wanted the quilt to look like. I wanted to complete the vision from beginning to end. And so that's why I've invested so much money in the setup of the Longarm, the specific machine that I got, the digital quilting. And so I'm not going to let somebody take that joy away from me by making this about what they want out of life and not what I want. So sometimes I am a little bit selfish, but I'm the one that worked towards this goal. So what I do with my time is what I want to be doing with my time. I can't fulfill other people's joy by doing what they want with my time. I have to do what I want. So I'm very adamant about that, both for myself and for other people. So I really warn people about letting other people overtake what you want out of quilting. If you're getting into it for business, that's great. And I know there's a ton of people that do that and make a lot of good money. And I'm very happy about that because that's what you want to be doing. But we have the quilt loaded. I'm catching up with myself, I feel, or catching up with my past, because this quilt top is probably 15 years old. And I know I have at least 10 other quilts upstairs. I just measured them out to try and figure out how to work them into a video so I can get those done as well. So as I said earlier, I know a lot of people are trying to escape their past. I'm just trying to catch up with my past and get some of these tops done. But what I would like to know, even for some of you beginners, is how many quilt tops you have that are finished, that are ready to be quilted. I know that I have at least 10. There's probably another 7 up there in various stages that could be finished very quickly. But I'm I'm going to be excited to get this one off the frame. I'd actually forgotten all about it until I was rummaging through trying to find a specific type of quilt, a medallion type of quilt for this specific whole cloth. So that's it for this video. There will be another video out within a week or so that's going to be how to baste a quilt, and then shortly following that there'll be a whole cloth digital quilt on this. So thanks for stopping by the studio today. I know I'm hot and grumpy so excuse my grumpiness today, but thanks for stopping by and keeping me company, and let me know how many quilt tops you have that are ready to quilt of your own. Until then, I'll see you next time, and hopefully I can go in the house and cool off.